want to welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. It's great to be in Sumter, and I know of no more important topic than what we're going to talk about this morning with three experts in their field. South Carolina is a gem of a state. I don't have to tell you, we're going to have people coming here in droves, and it's important to know what drives our economy. It's important to know, for the politicians to know, we don't give away South Carolina. We have clean, good paying jobs, and we recruit people who will add value to our great state. And it all starts with each one of you. I've toured a good many businesses in Sumter, going to continue more. Visit more. So thank each and every one of you. We've got a hard stop. I know, Michele, you got to leave at 12:30, 12:40, somewhere in there. Yeah, around 1 o'clock. But we'll go as long as we can. We'll have questions from the audience. But let me introduce our panelists. First is Dr. Joey VonNessen. Dr. Nessen is a research economist at the Darla Moore School of Business at the University of South Carolina. He graduated from Furman University. He's got his purple on this morning. In 2004 with a BA in economics and received his PhD in economics from the University of South Carolina in 2009. Dr. Nessen specializes in regional economics and housing economics. So goes housing, so goes the economy. He assists builders, developers, and other businesses by providing market research, economic, and consulting services. Dr. VonNessen is also responsible for the preparation and presentation of the University of South Carolina's annual statewide economic forecast. Welcome. Secondly, we have Michele Abraham. She served as the state director for the South Carolina Small Business Development Center since 2010. In this capacity, Michele manages a network of professional advisors in 20 centers throughout the state who provide business development assistance and expertise to small business and entrepreneurs. Michele received a Bachelor of Arts degree in communications with minors in journalism and public relations from Bowling Green State University in 1975. Her career has spanned work in both the private and the public sectors, involving positions in marketing, business development, sales management, strategic planning, product management, and general management for small, medium, and large companies. She has also owned and operated 2 successful businesses for over 15 years. Michele, welcome. Finally, Dr. Bryan Grady. Dr. Grady is the Labor Market Information Director at the South Carolina Department of Employment and Workforce. He works great with our office, both in D.C. and in South Carolina. In this capacity, he oversees production of data and analysis on employment, wages, and related topics. Prior to his arrival at DEW in January of 2020, Dr. Grady was the Chief Research Officer at the South Carolina State Housing Finance and Development Authority for 3 years. Dr. Grady holds a PhD in Planning and Public Policy from Rutgers University and degrees in Economics from the University of Delaware and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I welcome each one. Come on up on stage. Y'all, we've got water and coffee and some great cookies at the back, so help yourself. Thank you. Folks, what we'll do is we'll have a series of questions that I think will be pertinent to each one of you. The first question to each one of you: what is your current professional assessment of the South Carolina economy and our labor force? Dr. VonNessen.
Well, good morning. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, excellent. Well, first of all, thank you again, Congressman, for inviting us to participate today. It's an honor to be with you and to be with everyone this morning to have this important conversation. In terms of our outlook of the state of South Carolina, for the state of South Carolina as we look forward, I think there are 2 points that we'll come back to and flesh out in more detail. But the first point is that South Carolina right now, the state of the economy is very strong. South Carolina's economy is firing on all cylinders. We've seen most economic metrics in South Carolina that have either largely or fully recovered from the pandemic-related losses that were incurred between February and April of 2020. And this is true whether we're looking at employment trends overall, the number of people working, the size of the labor force, unemployment insurance claims, consumer demand. All of these different metrics in South Carolina, again, largely or fully recovered from the pandemic-related losses. So that's where we are today in May of 2022. However, as we look forward, the second point is that the likelihood of recession is higher now than it has been at any point in the last 2 years during this economic recovery. And that's true for a number of reasons, which again, we'll go into later. But primarily, we look ahead to high rates of inflation, which is already beginning to pull down the purchasing power of South Carolinians and of Americans more generally, because inflation is rising faster than wages. And so that's beginning to bring down overall consumer demand. And that's also necessitating the Fed to be more proactive with raising interest rates, which again is going to put downward pressure on overall demand. So the best phrase I can use for the outlook to really think about how we can expect the likelihood of recession to ebb and flow as we move forward is all eyes are on the Fed. So how quickly, how aggressive does the Fed get with raising rates, and what are the implications for demand? And we'll talk again in more detail about that. So that's the high-level view in terms of the summary points of where we are and where we're likely headed.
Michele.
Well, my focus is on small and mid-sized businesses. So when I look at the economy, as Joey said, it's definitely improved dramatically from where we were a couple of years ago. But when you think about small and mid-sized businesses, those are the ones that are still really struggling more so with the impacts of COVID. They got a lot of financial assistance during that time, which was a great blessing on everybody, but as they've spent through that money, we've got people with great credit issues, with ongoing challenges with supply chain, and so we're still seeing quite a few small businesses go under and struggle with how they're going to move forward. And as Joey said, I think also as we look ahead, the concern about the potential recession is one that has everybody very guarded. Truist did a small business pulse survey of businesses with revenues of between $100,000 and $2 million. And the major concerns that came back from these businesses were ongoing impact of COVID, that was 31%, inflation, including labor shortage and supply chain disruptions, that was 28%, rising costs, obviously related to inflation as well, 28%, and then the economic uncertainty of knowing that there may be a recession coming.
Dr. Grady.
Thank you, Congressman. So a lot of what I would say is generally in line with what Dr. VonNessen said. So the most recent data that we have for South Carolina in March, 3.4% unemployment rate. That is not quite down to where it was before the pandemic, but that's obviously a very historically good number that's indicative of a very hot labor market that is in fact contributing to some of these inflation issues. I would say that we have over 2.3 million South Carolinians who are working. That's the most that there's been in our state's history, so that's obviously a positive indicator. I think overall, I personally, I'm feeling pretty confident about the ability to make a soft landing, but certainly, as was mentioned earlier, it's up to the Federal Reserve to try to manage, the trade-off between inflation and employment, which is their mandate. And I think we're certainly still seeing economic disruptions. We're seeing dislocations. We're seeing people who are, we're seeing businesses that are obviously struggling to find the talent that they need. And we'll certainly get into that, I think, in greater detail with some discussion later. But I would certainly agree that the overall state of South Carolina's economy and its labor force is very robust, and certainly there's things to keep tabs on. But I don't think there's a need to panic.
What sectors, and this is just for general discussion, starting with Dr. VonNessen, what sectors are doing particularly well in South Carolina, and what sectors, in your opinion, are struggling? Dr. VonNessen.
So most sectors are doing well overall in terms of the rate of recovery that they have seen. I'd say if we want to isolate a few that have done exceptionally well, housing being number one for South Carolina construction overall. So enormous growth over the last 2 years. We've seen that in terms of sales activity, new construction. We've seen that in terms of price appreciation. And in fact, that has caused concern over affordability and other consequences associated with higher house prices. But the housing market in general has been doing very well in construction. Manufacturing has been doing well over the past 2 years, has seen sizable recovery. And we've seen leisure and hospitality come back strong, although leisure and hospitality has really struggled with the labor shortage, more so than any other sector. But those three have come back strong, have seen very strong wage gains on the whole. If we look at areas that have struggled, I mentioned leisure and hospitality in the sense that they're struggling with labor more than others. A couple of other sectors where we've seen some trouble bouncing back from a labor standpoint. The healthcare sector still down. Particularly for nursing. There was a shortage of nurses before the pandemic began. That is still the case today. If we look at local government, we haven't seen much recovery in that space, probably because generally we tend to see local government not come back as quickly when there is a downturn. And secondly, this is in terms of employment now. When local government needs to staff up, sometimes they have difficulty competing with the private sector, particularly when we're seeing a lot of wage gains right now. And then finally, I come back to construction. Again, as a good news, bad news story, kind of the outlier, because they have done very well, but they are also more susceptible to these rising interest rates that we're going to see from the Fed going into the second half of the year. We're already seeing mortgage interest rates go back up. They've gone up at least 2% since the start of the year. I don't know what the latest number is there, but a minimum of 2%. And that's likely to continue because banks and other financial institutions are anticipating further rate increases, and so they're beginning to price that in. So I think one concern I have is that construction may disproportionately be affected by these rising rates as we move to the second half of the year. So construction's been doing well, but they have some potential headwinds on the horizon as well.
Before Michele gives her opinion, most of you know I'm in the real estate development. We build things, commercial and residential. You cannot get a water heater on time now. There's certain, if you want copper, this administration is doing away with all mining for rare minerals, copper, you name it. You go on the car lot, try to find a new car. They can't get the computer chips. So we've got a supply crisis that affects us because most of us operate on borrowed money. The longer it takes to get product, the more it's going to cost ultimately the consumer. Michele.
Well, I would agree with what both of you said in total. In addition, I think when you talk about some of the smaller businesses, one of the areas that we see still struggling is restaurants, food supply. And a lot of that is because of the labor shortage and the fact that folks, not everybody has been able to make those adjustments in the way they run their business to get customers back after they'd been shut down and to get the employees back that they need to run the business. When you think about some of those industries like tourism, hospitality, restaurants, with the whole issue of remote employment now being a necessity for most employers, those are industries that can't have people working remotely. They have to be able to go into the location. And so it's even more of a struggle for them to get people on board. From the standpoint of healthcare, aside from the issue of finding people, it has been very strong in terms of a lot of the smaller businesses, physicians' businesses, other healthcare organizations, because the demand has certainly been there. Where that heads, we'll see with what the economy brings. And the other thing I think is when you look at all of the supply chain interruptions, not only domestically but globally, one of the things that we're seeing a lot of is with smaller to mid-sized businesses getting into logistics and transportation, a lot of businesses starting up and getting a lot of demand in trucking and that kind of thing because a lot of those folks that we depended on before aren't there to support us. I think that one of the things we're seeing is exporting and people that are dependent upon imported products because of the supply chain issues are really struggling. We're hearing that a lot in the international trade market.
Dr. Bryan.
Yeah, I mean, again, a lot of what's been said already is certainly what we're seeing in the more detailed employment and wage data. So when you look at, there's a feature in our most recent Trends magazine that my division publishes. It's available on the DO website. It goes into the 20 industries that saw 20% of their employment or more vanish as a result of the initial wave of the pandemic. And basically across the board, the story is those industries have struggled to add staff. They've struggled to get the workers that they had pre-pandemic, and there has been dramatic wage increases in a lot of those sectors. In some cases, as much as wages doubling over what they were in 2019 to try to attract workers. So certainly that's, if you're somebody who has that job, well, that's great for you, but that obviously causes substantial strains, particularly for small and mid-sized businesses that have less of an ability to manage those margins. So there's a lot to unpack there, but certainly as mentioned, leisure and hospitality is one of those sectors that certainly has had substantial wage increases. So while, for example, statewide, generally, wage increases have not kept up with inflation, particularly in those industries and in the parts of the state that have a lot of that, particularly Horry County, you've seen where wages have kept up because those businesses are so desperate to do that. And certainly I've spoken many times now with the reporters in Myrtle Beach who are fixated on that. But, I would say overall, I think what's already been said pretty much covers it.
Yeah, I would just want to add one other comment just to put a fine point on leisure and hospitality, just to put some perspective on the labor shortages that they're experiencing. So in South Carolina overall, between February and April of 2020, we lost about 15% of our total employment base, which is about roughly 308,000 jobs. But leisure and hospitality lost 50. So just far and away more losses than the state as a whole and any other sector. And so they really have had a deep hole to climb out of, which goes back to why we're seeing the labor shortage more pronounced in leisure and hospitality, arguably than any other sector.
Just to highlight what the panelists are saying, I went through a McDonald's a month ago, was in line, the doors were locked, and started ordering, and they said, well, sir, you've got a limit of $10.30. I said, a limit? She said, yeah. I said, can you tell me why? I've never had that happen. Yeah, she said, you've got me taking your order. I've got one cook trying to put the order together. This has a long-term impact because they're not making the money. They can't find the workers. The leases that we have with tenants, this is not bode well for their continued viability. And it's a serious problem. Michele, let's start off with you. We've talked about some obstacles. What other obstacles that in South Carolina that you think directly impact our state that you can cite? And how do we overcome them?
Well, I think for small and mid-sized businesses, one of the greatest obstacles is access to capital, which has always been a problem for those smaller businesses. A lot of them have gotten into business, have been very successful, but have never really put in place good fiscal management systems, bookkeeping systems, the kind of documentation they need when they do need to go seek a loan or some kind of financing. They don't have it all put together in order to do that. So during COVID, when all of the terrific packages came out through the PPP and the EIDL and the restaurant recovery, all of those different programs, a lot of the people that most needed it weren't prepared to go accomplish that. And we worked with, in 1 year, over 22,000 people in South Carolina to help them with that and other issues that they were having. And that's compared to that. I have a staff of 50 people around the state, and that's compared to an average of about 5,000 a year. So as you can see, we've had our hands full and certainly passionate about trying to help those folks. But a lot of those programs had very short deadlines, And if they didn't have the documentation together and couldn't spend a lot of time very quickly in getting it pulled together, they weren't able to qualify and get that financing. Others who did have spent that money now and have considerable debt buildup that now they've got to figure out how to pay back. So one of the things that we're trying to do is not only help them access capital where it makes sense, and it may not always make sense because they may not want to or should take on additional capital or debt, but trying to help them figure out, okay, how do we strengthen our business? How do we reduce our costs? How do we become more streamlined and efficient as we move forward to become more sustainable? So that's certainly one of the biggest issues when you talk about smaller businesses. Certainly the labor shortage is affecting small businesses just as much as anybody, maybe more so because they don't have as much of a reach sometimes in terms of finding people for those positions, and they're not always as able to pay the kinds of salaries that their larger counterparts can. So that's a challenge I think we're going to continue to face as long as we continue with the labor shortage. And then finally, I think the other big thing is the supply chain issues. We've got a lot of smaller suppliers who are in construction, who are in manufacturing, who are in agriculture, who can't get the parts and the components and the raw materials they need. And that's not only causing price increases, cost increases to them, which is reducing their overall profit and their sustainability, but it's also crippling them in terms of being able to get the products out the door to bring the revenues in to pay for, what they're having to pay to get the products in.
Dr. Grady.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, Michelle's absolutely right on all of that. I mean, I think that supply chain is something certainly that personally I thought we would have worked through by now, just to a large extent. But the policy decisions that are being made in China are certainly making that more complicated when you're locking down cities of 25, 30 million people and shutting down all the factories and causing all of these sorts of knock-on effects. Obviously we've talked about inflation. I think the biggest question that every business faces in an inflationary environment is how much of those price increases do I try to eat in my profit margin, and how much do I have to pass on to customers? And I think that's obviously a calculation that every business is going to make independently, and what those calculations look like is really going to have go a long way in determining how softly the landing goes in the broader economy.
I think we're going to see it, and we already have seen it on the grocery store shelves. There are a lot of products that just you can't get now. There's been, and this is an anomaly that I can't explain, the average of plants, packaging plants that have been either had fires or had some kind of issues has been average 8 or 9 a year for as long as I can remember. You know how many there's been in 2022? 22 that have been disabled through fire. And it goes to show, a processing plant, that's where the animals go to, that's where the process starts. You're going to see a severe shortage, and you wonder why this is happening. But it is happening. 22, and we haven't even hit mid-year yet. Dr. Bryan, this will go for you. When do you, from your data, see the labor shortages subsiding, and how much longer will this be an issue for businesses?
Well, I see, I think the labor shortage, one of the things I think we have to understand about the labor shortage is that it is likely to be long-lived. So we will likely see some relief later this year as demand begins to recede a bit. But the labor shortage itself is based more on structural changes to the economy resulting from demographic shifts than it is to COVID-related factors. So in the short run, as we look ahead to the second half of the year, consumer spending is already beginning to come back down. That's the result of high inflation. As we've talked about, inflation is outpacing wage growth, so consumers are beginning to have to make choices and trade-offs as to what they can afford and buy, so that's pulling demand down. And also we're seeing the waning effects of the federal stimulus. that provided more financial resources to American households. So if we look at that pullback in demand, that will have an effect on the labor shortage simply because the demand is coming back down, so not as much labor will necessarily be needed. But, so some relief in the short run. But more generally, if we look at long-run trends, this is a problem that's going to be with us for the foreseeable future. And I think that's a key takeaway today, is that the labor shortage is likely to be a defining challenge for South Carolina for the next decade. And there are two data points that we can put on this to illustrate. Number one, if we look at demographic patterns changing, the baby boomers are, of course, retiring, in the process of retiring, and millennials and Gen Z are coming in as the new majority workforce in South Carolina and across the U.S. And when you do the math, there's simply fewer of Gen Z and millennials than there are of baby boomers who are leaving. It's just a difference in the number of people. So as a result, we are moving into a period where there are not going to be enough people to replace a lot of these positions that are being exited, that baby boomers are exiting. So this is a long-run shift in the labor market for the U.S. and is going to continue to create a labor shortage pressure. Secondly, if we look in South Carolina specifically, in addition to these national trends, in South Carolina we have very strong in-migration rates. We were second in the country last year, but most of the people moving into South Carolina are over the age of 55, about 2 in 3 we estimate. So that means that's great news for businesses from a demand perspective, right? Because all these people coming in, their consumers are going to be buying goods and services, buying housing, all these different, supporting all these different sectors, but only one of them is likely to be in the labor force for any significant period of time. So yes, we'll see some relief to this labor shortage if demand continues to abate in the coming months, but the underlying structural causes of this labor shortage are going to be with us for the foreseeable future.
Dr. Grady, you want to chime in?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the one thing that I feel like, as somebody who has looked at the numbers, is there was a lot of talk, particularly last year, about this concept of the Great Resignation, right? What's actually happened as the data have materialized is that was a fairly overblown fear. When you look at the labor force participation rate, percentage of people who are eligible to work, who are working or looking for work, that's been pretty stable recently. So there's not and as I mentioned, there's more South Carolinians working today than there have ever been. So you have seen some degree of on the margin, people who were thinking about maybe retiring, and then COVID happened and they were like, maybe I'll just call it a career, and went ahead and retired. You've seen a slight uptick in that, which kind of adds to the demographic shift that's been mentioned. The one thing I do want to highlight is this question of labor force participation is one that is a very hot button topic within my agency, and I think among others as well. It's fairly concerning because when you step away from the pandemic-related recession specifically, there has been a substantial decrease that's steeper than the national average in terms of labor force participation. South Carolina has about 57% of eligible workers who are in the labor force. The national average is about 62. We're fifth lowest among the states. So there's a task force that's been convened by my agency. I'm serving on it. Actually, Joey's other half is serving on it, as well as experts that we've convened from all over the country, quite frankly, to try to get at the question of why is South Carolina's labor force participation rate substantially lower than the national average, and then what are the potential solutions to that? Because certainly we want to make sure that South Carolina has a competitive workforce, that they have a wide variety of skills so that any business who wants to come here can find the workers that they need. And that's something that I'll be spending a lot of my time in the next 6 months to a year working on.
Michele.
Well, just a couple things to add. One of the things that we see, and again, maybe the markets I deal with are a little different than overall what the statistics show, but we've seen a tremendous number of people come to us wanting to start a business. They quit their jobs or they were laid off during COVID and decided, I'm going to go take my life savings and start a business. And many of them hadn't really thought it through, hadn't done the proper feasibility studies, hadn't really done the due diligence they needed to do to ensure that it was going to be a long-term sustainable source of income. And so that's been a challenge that we've been dealing with and trying to help those people make the right decisions for themselves and their families. But as they go through this process, you know, we're seeing a lot of businesses get started that probably aren't going to make it over the long haul. And we know the statistics for new business starts are rather dismal anyway in terms of how many survive 5 years or more. The other thing, you know, we have seen in the businesses that we deal with a lot of people who opted to take retirement earlier than they otherwise would have because of everything that happened during COVID. So there was a lot of loss of employers or employees, especially people that have that institutional knowledge and experience that are very hard, as you said, to replace. But as we go through that, you know, it does impact the labor force. And we also saw a lot of people leave their jobs voluntarily or involuntarily and live on stimulus. And we're continuing to see a lot of people that have enough saved now that they don't really have to go back to work. So at some point, those funds are going to run out and they're going to be forced to go back into the workforce. And I think that will have some impact on what we see in overall employment.
Yeah, and just to emphasize, when you pay people not to work, you lose a certain segment of the workforce. And secondly, how do you start a business when you really can't determine what your costs are, starting with fuel prices? Fuel prices, if under what's happening in Washington, D.C. today, over the next six months, you're going to see fuel prices continue to go. That affects everything in this country, from the food that gets delivered by trucks to the airlines. And how do you gauge for that? You can't. Dr. Grady, let me address this to you. Wages and wage growth. What do you see in the next 12 to 24 months?
Well, if I knew exactly, I would put some money on Wall Street and figure it out. But you know, I think in terms of the overarching trend, I think what Dr. VonNessen indicated earlier is broadly accurate. That we will expect. As the overall economy slows down to some extent, kind of, you know, comes down from the overheating that it's experiencing currently with regard to inflation, there's certainly a likelihood that wage growth will decelerate to some extent. I think the major exception to that is the as mentioned, sort of those leisure and hospitality industries. I think we're certainly in a position where a lot of what people did in the last year or so is they had one job and they said to themselves, well, you know, I can probably find something that pays better or gives me a little more flexibility with my time or whatever people are looking for. And, you know, quite frankly, if you're an employer who's running a fast food restaurant, that's probably not going to be a very desirable job for a lot of people. So there have been challenges attracting the necessary workforce, and in a lot of cases, those are franchises, those are small businesses rather than large, massive corporations, right? So, you know, I would say that those sort of lower wage service jobs will probably continue to have substantial wage growth, just because employers are having trouble attracting people, and if they need to pay them $20 an hour, $25 an hour, then that's what they'll do, assuming they're in a position to do that. But I would say that overall, I would expect both wage increases and inflation in the overall economy, particularly toward the end of that 24-month time frame, will probably subside as the Federal Reserve acts and the economy, you know, the business cycle reasserts itself.
Michele?
I agree with pretty much everything that you all are saying. We've seen considerable wage growth already, and we expect more to come. But as we look forward and more people come back into the labor force and potentially we face a recession, that'll start to slow things down.
Dr. VonNessen.
Yeah, and I also agree with everything that's been said. I would just add that there are really no indicators that suggest that consumer demand isn't going to continue to pull back. Not necessarily contract, but pull back to levels that we were seeing before the pandemic began, because we've been in such an elevated bubble in terms of demand compared to historic norms for the last 2 years. So consumer spending, primarily driven by disposable income, and we've seen that spike in 2020 and 2021, that is receding as well back to historic norms. So the causal factors of demand, we're seeing very clearly pulling back to, again, pre-pandemic norms. And so as demand begins to recede, again, as has already been mentioned, that almost necessitates that we'll see less pressure on wage increases, because the demand for labor will still be strong, especially in certain sectors, but maybe not quite as strong as it has been in the last year or so.
What I'm hearing too all over the district is, where's the limit that people can pay for services? At what stage will people just say, I can't afford it? And to start a business, to create a product, and not know what your costs are. And folks, I will tell you, we don't know how you figure costs now. Very few companies that are selling product will lock in for any length of time other than what they have on their already stocked and in place and paid for. So that's the challenge we're on. Dr. VonNessen, let's start with you. We're hearing a lot about a recession on the horizon. Do you see this as a possibility? If so, why? And how do you think South Carolina will fare?
So as we look to the risk of recession, broadly speaking, I agree with the general consensus view that seems to be that a recession is more likely. I've seen probabilities as much as 30 or 40% from different forecasting entities. And generally, I think that that's correct, that we certainly have a higher risk now than we have at any point in the last 2 years. But as I mentioned before, all eyes will be on the Fed. And as we look at these rising interest rates, one of the ways that we can get a sense of whether or not the Fed is raising rates too quickly is to actually look at the job openings rate itself. So this is a metric that just measures the share of jobs in the economy that are currently open and unfilled. And what we've seen in the last 2 years, is that the job openings rate has been very much higher than what we would normally expect given the current unemployment rate, which is 3.4% in South Carolina. And so when you see a pullback in demand, usually with most businesses, they're going to pull the help wanted signs out of the windows before they actually lay off workers, right, when they see a decline in demand or a pullback in demand. And so we would expect that before we go into a recession that creates job losses, we're going to see that job openings rate begin to pull back. And so what I would suggest as a good leading indicator right now is that job openings rate. That's really the wiggle room that the Fed has to raise rates and create the soft landing that Dr. Grady had talked about without putting us into a recession. So to give a specific number for that, the job openings rate currently is about 7%. Historically, it's about 5% when we see an unemployment rate that's where it is now at around 3.5% in South Carolina. So that's the wiggle room. So I think, again, the likelihood of recession, yes, it is elevated because we are seeing high inflation, which is cutting into purchasing power and requiring that the Fed take more proactive approach. And the job openings rate is a good way to assess how much wiggle room that they have. And remind me of the second question.
No, how does South Carolina compare to other states?
Right, okay, so how would we fare in terms of a recession? I think that in some cases, depending on the industry and the region, in some cases we do better than the national average, in some cases not so much. So for example, Columbia tends to have more industries that don't see the booms and the busts associated with expansion and recessions compared to Charleston and Greenville-Spartanburg that have a lot more volatility. But in 2022, as we look across the world, there are other economies that are struggling right now as well. So there's a high likelihood that Europe will go into recession this year, and possibly China as well with these lockdowns. And that becomes a problem for South Carolina, particularly for manufacturing, because we export so much of what we produce in South Carolina domestically, we sell domestically as well as export across the globe. And so if we see economies around the world that are also slowing down, then that's international demand that's going to affect manufacturers in South Carolina. So there is a likelihood that we see all three economies go into recession at about the same time. That would create a larger effect for South Carolina. So that's something to be watching too.
Michele.
Well, the one thing I would add to that is that over the years, I've been in South Carolina in this position about 12 years now, and what we've seen in past recessions is that small business doesn't recover at the same rate. It takes a lot longer than the rest of the economy. And so for us and the people that we deal with, it's really a challenge trying to keep help keep them going and figuring out how to sustain through that very slow recovery process. And I think for us, part of it is the fact that we have so many rural areas in the state. And when you look at the demographics and access to broadband and all of those other issues that affect rural businesses, I would anticipate that we'll see the same thing again with another recession coming on top of all the things that Joey just mentioned.
Dr. Bryan.
Yeah, I mean, I would say certainly there's a clear risk of a recession. I mean, I think that's fair to say. I certainly don't think it's an inevitability. I think the probabilities that Dr. VonNessen cited are probably broadly accurate. Again, it depends on how the Federal Reserve acts, how various, all sorts of different world events, whether it's war in Ukraine or other factors, certainly have a relevant contribution there. I think what he also said about the job openings rate is very accurate. There's basically what we've seen in the last year is there's just a lot more churn in the labor market. As I mentioned earlier, people are kind of trading from one job to another. So you've got a lot of people who are quitting their jobs, but you've got even more people who are getting hired for jobs. But the problem is the third number is even higher, which is the number of job openings that businesses have available. So I think in terms of the question of how South Carolina will fare, I mean, I think certainly I would say probably somewhat better than the national average. I think the major issue is just having a diversified economic base, right? Making sure that we have a wide array of employers and a wide array of industries, so that if something happens to a particular part of the supply chain or some other factor, that doesn't compound the downturn.
Yeah, and I tell you what's going to affect South Carolina. We've got a diversified base here. I know when I went to the border, we were at midnight, went on a raid to see who's coming in. We stopped one and asked him where he was going. It's just a random stop. And his response was Charleston because of Boeing. Sumter's no different. Rock Hill's no different. We're going to have a rash of illegals that's going to put a strain on our economies, our hospitals, our schools. And I ask people, how are you going to react to this? What is your plan because when Title 42 goes away, which when I go back to Congress, they will probably let it expire on the 23rd, to give you put it in perspective, we will have estimated 5 football stadiums at Carolina, which holds 79,000 people per month, come into this country. 5. Now, South Carolina will be on the radar to come. They won't speak the language. They have no known skill, and this is of all types. That's what's as concerning as anything I've seen. That's what's happening in this country, and it's going to affect the economies, and it's going to affect everybody. Okay, short of adding to the federal debt and pumping billions of federal dollars into the state economy, what can the federal government be doing to help South Carolina? And what should the South Carolina state government be doing? Michele, let's start with you on this.
Well, I think one thing is to encourage and support expanding our domestic supply chain. The more we can build the capability of producing things in the country so we don't have to rely on China and other countries for those parts, those products, the stronger we're going to be. That's probably at the federal level one of the big things. Certainly here in the state, continuing to look at how we can support small businesses in terms of, one of the things that we're trying to do at the Small Business Development Centers is work with people to figure out how to diversify their own business bases. How to not put all their eggs in one basket, if you will. So, for example, we have a lot of manufacturing clients who supply to Boeing or BMW, and that represents 80 to 100% of their business. Those OEMs don't want to see suppliers doing that. And so what we try to do is help people assess, okay, where else could our products be sold? How could we diversify so that we've got a broader base of business like the state does to help us sustain over those humps and those challenges. So I think, within the state, working with organizations like ours to help get that word out and help people do that strategic planning and figuring out how to strengthen their businesses would be another thing that we could do on that front.
Dr. Grady?
One thought I had before answering your question was what Michele mentioned. It's worth noting that there are counties, the county in the state with the highest unemployment rate is 7.5%. So there are rural communities that basically are always in a recession, quite frankly, in terms of the way their labor market acts. So that's something that we need to keep an eye on. Specific to your question, I'm certainly not, as an executive branch employee of the state of South Carolina, not going to comment on what legislation should or should not be passed at the state level. At the federal level, in terms of something that could be done for economic and workforce development that's not an expenditure, I kind of lean back to my previous experience that was mentioned at the State Housing Authority. And there's a quote that Mark Nix, who runs the State Home Builders Association, tends to say, and he says, "A home is where a job goes to sleep at night." So there's always a deep connection between housing supply and workforce, because if people can't afford to live somewhere, that makes it harder for businesses to attract people. So I would say that there's bipartisan legislation that's been kicking around for a while that would essentially incentivize local governments to identify places where there's excessive red tape that's getting in the way of housing construction and development, and basically restricting the kinds of housing that can get built, and basically would kind of ask communities to kind of reevaluate that, not telling them what to do, but saying, we got to make sure that we can bring in the workers that we need, that we can, that everybody from the mailroom to the C-suite can afford to live in a certain community and provide the workforce that's needed. So that would be my little bit off the wall answer.
Dr. VonNessen?
I would say we need to also, I agree with everything that's been said. I would also say that we need to build on the competitive advantages that we already have as a state. And two of those that businesses consistently mention are infrastructure and workforce development. So by infrastructure, I mean everything from the South Carolina port to our roads and bridges and railway systems. And again, with manufacturing being such a critical part of the state's economy, that provides the resources for companies to locate here, to expand here, and to ship their products both domestically and internationally. So as we build a brand of manufacturing, as we have in the past, making sure that we keep our infrastructure maintained and improved and to accommodate the increasing demand that we're likely to see in manufacturing. And the second is workforce development. I think that's especially true with respect to the technical college system, which has national programs that have received national attention and have been award-winning. Ready SC is one, Apprenticeship Carolina is another. And I think in that case, it's about expanding those programs and doing more of what we have done so well and meeting the needs of employers and training the employees and building that bridge and making that connection point. And again, these are competitive strengths that the state has that companies have repeatedly stated publicly. So I think infrastructure, workforce development, two keys to our success in the past and will be going forward.
I would add one other thing to that at the state level, and I know the legislature has made strides and continues to look at it, but thinking in terms of how do we reduce the red tape for businesses, especially the small and medium-sized businesses. The tax structure is complicated if you're doing business in different counties and different states. The regulations, the licenses, trying to find ways to streamline that certainly would help businesses.
Speaking of that, we're at Central Carolina Technical College here in Sumter. What role do the tech schools play, and how can we help them, I guess, get more publicity? Because of what you offer is what tech schools offer. The young people don't realize what's out there, and particularly with the money that's involved. Any of you can weigh in?
Sure. I mean, I think absolutely the technical college system and career programs offered at high schools, I mean, I think are extremely undervalued resources. Certainly one of the things that we're looking at the Department of Employment and Workforce is getting a handle on, where are there where there are skill gaps, where there are credentials that we need to try to recruit more people to obtain to make sure that our businesses can hire who they need. And then you also had the broader question. I've lost my train of thought. I will pass it off to someone else. I'll come back.
Well, I would build on that. I think the technical schools now are more important than they've ever been. And I think the recognition of the kind of skills they can teach is greater than it's ever been. I know, when I was growing up, when I was in high school and college, there was a bit of a stigma with a lot of the technical schools, and I think a lot of that has passed, particularly with the change in our economy and the kind of skill sets that are needed today. Technical schools answer a need that nobody else can. We have programs that we work with a number of technical schools in the state on. For example, a lot of small businesses getting into trucking and logistics, and we work with several of the tech schools in helping those people get educated on how do I start a small business, along with those credentials that they're getting in the specific discipline. So there's tremendous opportunity to go beyond where we are today.
And I think this is a great time to do this. It's as much of a marketing problem as it is an economic problem, I would say, because if we look at just some straight wage comparisons of different occupations based on the different degrees and certifications that you can obtain in South Carolina at all the different institutions, it's very clear that we see in a lot of these trades that are in high demand, very strong career paths, very high wages offered compared to a lot of four-year degrees, and especially with the conversation shifting back towards the cost of college and with everything going on with student loan debt and those types of conversations. Now's the time to talk about these costs and benefits for high school students who are looking at a career. They want to know what their long-run opportunities are, and we can do a better job, I think, of marketing what those different options are across the board. And again, to Michele's point, is something that we may not have done very well in the past, but we can certainly build on.
And that's something that actually is kind of my job at DO, is as the Labor Market Information Director, is to, we produce data like that, and we kind of just put it out there and don't really talk about it too much. It's on our website. We produce annual data on wages by occupation, quarterly and monthly data on industrial employment and wages. But we want to do a better job promoting the information that we have, and B, get at break it down a little more specifically. It's one thing to say, oh well, you can make more if you get certification X or degree Y. But looking at the question of return on investment, and that's a matter of getting data from us at DO, because we have data on employment and wages because we oversee the unemployment insurance system. Obviously, colleges, whether that's 4-year or 2-year, have data on who's attending, what degrees they're getting, what certifications, credentials they're getting. And then basically being able to say, well, okay, so if you go out and want to get a certificate in welding, what does that get you in how much money are you putting in and how much money are you going to get out of it? And using real people rather than just hypothetical examples to get at that question. So that's certainly something that is on my research agenda as we bring in statisticians and other people to help conduct those sorts of analysis.
Before we wrap up, are there any questions from the audience that you would like to ask? Christy has got our microphone. Yes, sir, right here. Hold on, get the microphone first.
Oh, okay, thanks. I'd just like to ask, as a nation, our trade deficit continues to set new records. Number one, how does that impact the nation? Number two, how does that impact South Carolina? And how is South Carolina doing versus its out-of-state imports versus exports?
Well, I'd say for South Carolina, if we look at where our demand comes from and what we've been seeing in the last few years, imports are certainly up significantly because we've seen so much of a surge in demand over the last 2 years. If we look at durable goods expenditures especially, there has been basically a goods bubble where we've seen more and more purchasing activity. That's been, number one, because people have been staying home, haven't been purchasing services, so they've been substituting towards more spending on goods. And then secondly, because we've seen households that have been much more flush with cash. They've been in a better financial position, particularly in 2021, because we saw a broad recovery of the labor market, people earning wages, and we had these stimulus funds that were providing resources to households as well. So if you look at that high level of demand, that significantly increased the level of import activity that we were seeing for the U.S. as a whole. Exports have been down, particularly in the latter half of 2021. That was a principal reason why we saw a decline in growth in the first quarter, negative 1.4% for GDP overall. So right now, that balance, we definitely see more coming from import activity for the United States. I think going forward, we will likely see that begin to balance out a bit more, certainly than it has been in the last 2 years, because a lot of that has to do with the supply chain disruptions combined with the elevated demand that has resulted in the goods market because people have been staying home.
Michele, anybody want to weigh in on that?
He covered it.
Dr. Brady?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's broadly reflective of what's going on, and I would say that there's always a trade-off there, as there are with most things. And I think we have a pretty good, clear sense of what the downsides of a trade deficit are, and we've seen that with supply chain issues. We've seen the disruptions of not having enough suppliers that are based in the United States. On the flip side, the trade deficit is basically the rest of the world saying, we'll give you stuff and you don't have to pay us back for it. So there's also a positive there of the ability of consumers in the United States to be able to access a wider array of goods. And really the trade-off between those two things is really a political question.
And I think it's also an open question, at least from the data that we've seen, as to whether we're going to see significant onshoring to get away from the just-in-time delivery method, because there's been so much disruption over the last 2 years. Because many companies and industries are looking at it from the perspective that if you look over a 10-year or longer time period, despite these supply chain disruptions that they're dealing with now, the just-in-time delivery method works and is broadly successful for them over a decade-long period. So in other words, the benefits during an expansion period far outweigh the costs that they've had to deal with during this pandemic period. Now, whether or not we're going to see more movement towards secondary suppliers or more companies are going to the calculus will change on that going forward. Again, we don't know yet, but I think it's still very much an open question as to whether we see significant reshoring or a change in the business model, particularly for manufacturers, because of what's been happening over the last 2 years.
Is there another question? Christy?
Hi, I have a question about the onshoring. Is it possible to incentivize that for the United States? These workers who 50% in the fast food industry who are not working, we could shift them over into a manufacturing area if we re-incentivize reshoring. I mean, is that a possibility?
Yes, it's certainly a possibility. I think that's more of a political question. How do you do that? Tariffs is one way to incentivize that type of activity. And I think that when you're in a labor market where we are right now, where there's a labor shortage, it does provide more negotiating power for workers in general to move up the workforce and move into higher wage, higher skilled positions. So let's say you're moving from leisure and hospitality to manufacturing or some other sector. Now's the time for workers to be able to do that, or to have a better opportunity to do that, because the labor shortage again gives them more of an ability to negotiate, whether that's additional skills training on the part of the employer, paying for school, all these different things. But this is the best job market that we've seen for workers in a generation, no question about it, and it's an opportunity for workers to take advantage of what we're seeing right now.
Are there any more questions from the audience?
Hi, my name is Judy. I'm the Sumter Easy Home, manufacturer here. I come here supposed to shut down this business because we cannot find enough the labor. But when I first day arrived here, I find a street, not like California, a lot of people make money. I said, hey, that's a good opportunity because you can see people walking because they are not on the street, ask money. I said, how about continue to have business here? But we've been here 4 or 5 years. We never find enough people working. Okay, we just a very simple parking job. We don't need a diploma. We don't need anything. We supposed to have 3 chefs and weekend chef. We need when we come here, it's Walmart with the city invite us come here. Then when we come here, we find out we cannot find people working. And we need to have an HR company to do this job. And we have to pay $1 million for this HR company. And the other problem is that people cannot, the ownership, they cannot from China come here to handle this business. Okay, so I'm the Taiwanese American Chambers, United States Vice President. So I travel a lot the state to see. And I find out I don't need like a Pennsylvania with the top 10 business, go to the street, go to gas station to find people. You want to working? Because they are drive a truck. I think they would like to work. And here, I don't think we need to do that. Then I went to the police station and asked them.
We're running short on time. Ask a question so we can.
Sure. I just want to find out how can we find the people.
How can we find, how can we find the people?
And we don't have people. Our machines are there and labor. How can we?
Well, Dr. Grady, you may want to take that on some specific programs that DO is implementing.
Yeah, so certainly there are other dimensions at DO that are working on this from a number of different angles. The thing that comes to mind is the Labor Force Participation Task Force that I mentioned earlier. Is we have a smaller percentage of our people in South Carolina are working than the national average. Now, part of that is probably the fact that South Carolina has a large number of retirees that live here, and you're not going to get somebody who's necessarily going to be interested in getting back in the workforce. But part of what this task force is designed to do, and this isn't a thing that's going to happen overnight, unfortunately, but we're going to be commissioning a study that's going to investigate, okay, why is our number lower than other states? What are the relevant factors for that? And actually going and asking people who were previously in the labor force and then claimed unemployment insurance and are no longer in our wage records, basically asking them, what are the reasons that you're not seeking employment right now, and try to get at, is there anything that can be done about that? We're going to try to bring in some researchers who are going to investigate this, and they'll ultimately have some recommendations that we'll review and we'll present to the state legislature and others that will look at this question of, okay, is it because someone has a disability and is unable to work? Is there anything we can do to either give them a ride to a factory or figure out what they can do remotely or what have you? Is someone a caregiver for a child or a parent? Is there anything that can be done to help make it so that person can find a job if they want to find a job? Identifying those impediments and then figuring out what can be done about them. Because quite frankly, as we said, very low unemployment rate. Obviously, a lot of people talking labor shortage. So, finding new pools of people that we can bring into the labor force, I think, is ultimately the solution there, especially with the demographic issues that Dr. VonNessen mentioned.
Okay, I think we got time for one last question right here, ma'am.
What is being done in the state of South Carolina to stop and prevent ESGs in both the public and in the private sector?
ESGs?
It's an environmental score they're asking the companies to sign on to. And it's part of what you're seeing with a lot of companies. Bank of America is leading the charge on this. Disney's leading the charge. It's kind of a litmus test on, environment, social government.
I see, okay.
You check the list off.
Well, I don't know if I can speak to that question specifically. I would say that the companies are looking, I guess just a broad comment, that companies are looking to establish a brand and to operate within that brand consistently. And they are taking actions that they feel are consistent with with their brand, with the image that they want to attract the customer base that they are looking for. But beyond that, I can't really speak to the specifics of that from a political standpoint of how they are responding or interacting with the government in that way.
Folks, let me tell you, that's where they need to hear from you. Corporate leaders are supposedly representing their shareholders, and the left, who's promoting the far left green agenda that money is flowing to left and right from Washington, D.C. Each company in Sumter needs to hear from you to say, are you doing this, and what's the purpose of another regulation that, Michele, you were talking about, that businesses need to pay for and face if we don't do something about it. So I can tell you it's alive and it's well, and it's something we need to address. And federally, it's going to be tough until changes are made, and then after that, hopefully we can do it. All right, we got to wrap up. Quick rundown. What are 1 to 2 things that each of you want South Carolina business leaders to know? Dr. VonNessen.
I'd say the most important thing for business leaders to know, number one, is that this labor shortage is not short term. It's something that's going to be with us because of all the reasons we've talked about with the demographic changes. So businesses need to be prepared for that, and to be prepared to deal with this for the foreseeable future, and to get creative and think of other ways to, whether it's raising wages or providing benefits or adjusting the business model, relying less on labor, more technology, all these different things to adjust to a labor shortage that is likely to be a defining challenge for the state for the foreseeable future. So that's point number one. And then point number two, getting back to the likelihood of recession. I think, going back to my comment before, all eyes are on the Fed. Keep your eye on what the Fed does. They're going to be the ones that have to navigate a soft landing, get inflation back down without sending us into a recession. And if there's one metric that you want to track to see how that is going, I would bring you back to the job openings rate. That's a metric that's really important to watch, because we're going to see the job openings come back down before we see layoff activity. So keep your eye on the Fed and how that's affecting the job openings rate.
Michele.
I would say on a little less of a macro level, when you look at the state of South Carolina, I think a lot of folks in the public don't realize how many resources we have in the state that can really help businesses, especially when you're talking about small and mid-sized businesses. And so I think it's really vital that we continue to be partners, that we collaborate to leverage our collective resources to help those in business that need support to continue to grow and thrive and deal with the struggles that are there. And secondly, I think most of the folks at the state level know, but for all of the businesses that are here and watching this, the Small Business Development Centers, we're part of a national network, and we were established by Congress. We provide business consulting at no fee, and it's available to anybody that's a small or mid-sized business. We've got 20 locations around the state, 50 people that are all small business owners that have all kinds of experience from different industries and walks of life, and who are passionate about making sure that we're doing what we can to help you. So, just encourage people to make sure that you're helping folks that need that help or could use that help, be aware of it, and call upon us to help provide that.
Dr. Grady.
Like Michele, I'm also going to give a bit of a plug. The Labor Market Information Division at DO, we exist to help employers and job seekers find each other, to help people know what the labor market looks like and what their options are. So we certainly encourage people to get in touch with us. So we have our website is scworkforceinfo.com. It's a bit of a mess right now. We're working on making it better. To help find data, reports, analysis. And we also have a sort of an email inbox, which is lmicustomerservice@do.sc.gov. So if you're a business owner and you want to know stuff about what labor force is, what the labor force looks like, what workers are available, how much they're being paid in the market, come to us. We'll help you figure it out. I mean, we're here to work for the people and businesses of South Carolina to make sure that we're as prosperous as we can be. So that would be my thoughts.
To our panelists, I want to thank each one of you for taking the time to come here. It's been very informative for me. For our audience, thank you so much. Your voice matters. What you do matters. And reach out to our office. We've got people that specialists in so many areas that we can help with. So I've worked with all the panelists our office has, and believe me, they want to help. They go to work, and they are trying to do a great job for our great state. Thank each and every one of you. God bless you.